So without further ado, your taxes are being leaked, and how? Michael Wylie will let you know. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, thank you very much for joining me early in the morning for us hackers here in the beginning of Hacker Week in Vegas. This presentation has kind of changed a little bit since I submitted it. I first found a vulnerability that I wanted to share with the community and how I found it and what we can do better. But as I started doing more and more research into it and talking to some of the security teams, I found more and more, and it started snowballing up until about last week. I was on the phone with some of these vendors, and they're still struggling to fix some of the vulnerabilities. So it's kind of taken a little bit of a turn, and I've tried to defang some of it and anonymize some of it as they're still rolling out patches. Tomorrow they're rolling out more patches. Some of them haven't even addressed some of the vulnerabilities yet, and it's a long road to fix this. So I hope this can do good, and I've got this talk booked later in the year, and hopefully I can release more of the details. I've had to remove some of the specifics just to protect all of our tax data. So I think they did a great job introducing me, but basically I'm a co-founder of Corporate Blue. I do cybersecurity consulting, Department of Defense contractor. I do training for the US Department of Defense, some universities. I've built some pen testing programs for colleges, and I teach cybersecurity as well. So this is kind of an outline of what we'll go through. We're going to do a little bit of introduction to the tax prep industry and what I've kind of found on that. We'll do some look at the research and some of the case studies into breaches, specifically in California where I reside. We'll look at some cybersecurity laws and how they apply to CPAs and tax preparers. Then we'll look at some common breakdowns in the CPA security or tax preparers and what they're doing wrong. Then we'll analyze tax prep software and some of the ones I looked at, what the tax prep and CPA people are using. And then we'll go into a systemic issue that I found, or a lot of those issues when testing the software, and what I've been doing working with the vendors to fix some of these issues, and then what you can do and what your CPA can do to protect your taxpayer data. So the tax industry, I learned a lot doing some of this research into the industry. It's a large global market. $11 billion are going to these CPAs and tax prep people. I don't think this includes a lot of the advisory services like Ernst & Young and Deloitte are doing. These are just for tax preparation. In North America, it's $4.6 billion that they're generating. There's about 5 data breaches per week, according to the IRS in their report in 2017. 177 tax pros reported breaches from January to May in 2017. $5 billion was paid by the IRS in refunds to fraudulent attackers in 2013. And then the IRS claimed that they stopped $24.2 billion in fraudulent returns in 2013. So they did a good job in stopping a lot of those, but there's still a lot of fraudulent returns that are going on, and our refunds are going to the bad actors. So how do Americans file their tax returns? We can see that some people are going to H&R Block or those brick and mortar places. Others are self-filing. If you do that, kudos to you. 9.2% don't file taxes at all, apparently. And 10%, or just about 11%, they have a friend or a family that might know tax laws, and they file for them. And then a lot of people are using TurboTax, so 34%-ish will use TurboTax, and then almost 30% are using a CPA or tax preparer to do that. So I kind of broke this down based off of age as well, because I wanted to understand, and I think we're missing a piece of what about businesses? Because I think most businesses are going to use a CPA or tax preparer, but we can see the higher income earners, and as you get a little bit older, you're probably going to be using a CPA compared to filing yourself or using TurboTax or having a friend or family member do that. So the IRS, I saw a couple articles and people were saying, yeah, we're doing great as tax preparers. We're protecting your data. We've stomped a lot of these fraudulent filings. But yet even the IRS, 2016, 2017, 2018, are sending out these reports to tax preparers and CPA firms saying that there's a lot of warnings that they're seeing an increase in these fraudulent filings and taxpayer data being leaked. So thieves are able to access tax professionals' computers, use remote technologies to take control, accessing client data, and completing e-filing returns on behalf of all of us. So essentially, there's different ways, and I'll go into some of these that the attackers are doing, but they are able to get into the CPA or the tax firms, and they're looking for your and my extensions, and when they see that you filed for an extension, then they go ahead and file the return on your behalf, and they send your refund check to their P.O. box or some other place, and they take your taxes or your refund check for you. A special agent for the IRS, he's saying that the bad actors tend to go for the low-hanging fruit. I thought this was an important quote because a lot of the CPA firms, the smaller ones that I work with, they say, we're not really a target. We're not EY, we're not Deloitte, we're not KPMG, we're not really a target. But even the IRS and special agents saying, no, we're seeing that they're going for the low-hanging fruit. Deloitte, EY, et cetera, these are big players. They should have better security in there, but your little 5, 10, 15, 20 user, or even up to 100 CPA firms, they're a low-hanging fruit. They don't have the security controls in place. They're also seeing that Wi-Fi security is one of the biggest and most common threats for these small firms. So let's look at some of these case studies. So what I did is I went through the California breach notifications, and it's a little hard to dig into what I wanted because a lot of these CPA and tax prep firms, they're using their names. It's kind of like a law firm and you use like Wylie and Sons LLP or whatever it is. So I kind of have a hard time going through that and figuring out what are CPA firms versus law firms. So I had to use some keywords. Unfortunately, I only used CPA and tax as my keywords. I probably could have used accountancy or accounting as well. But I went through those keywords and I looked at every breach that I could find in the California database since 2015. And 2015 is when California set up their database and they started recording this information online. So that's all the data I had was 2015 to present. And each state has their own data breach laws and reporting requirements, so you can check out your own state, but I wanted to focus on what I knew, and that was California. So I had the 2015 to current data. I had to make some assumptions that most states, they've got only electronic breach requirements. So I don't know about you, if you go to a CPA or you've been to any of these places. I've been to plenty of CPA firms doing security assessments, and when I go there, I see piles and piles of paperwork, right? They've got tax stuff, and I get a little bit concerned when I go in there because I can see other people's income, tax returns all on the CPA's desk, and I wonder how many other people are coming in here and seeing my tax return sitting on your desk. And so almost all states do not require you to report if your physical files get taken. It's only for electronic files. So this 2015 to present breaches that I've researched and went through, they're only electronic breaches as well. We also have to assume that even though they're required to, it's kind of difficult to get caught unless, if someone broke into a CPA's firm and they got the digital records, they may get noticed, they may not, but even if they did get noticed by the CPA firm, it's not like the police are going to swoop in or the FBI or the CIA or the IRS and see that. So a lot of these places may just say, well, we're not really going to get caught, so why report it? We also see that in California, if it's less than 500 records, so if I'm a CPA firm and I have 499 of your records that got stolen, social security numbers, home addresses, spouse's information, child, dependents, etc., I do not have to report this as a breach. Also, if it's over 500 records and it's encrypted, so I lost 9,000 records in my firm, for example, but they were encrypted and they were using DES, or maybe they were just using MD5, or maybe they were really just base 64 encoded, I may not have to report that either. Companies, so as I mentioned, I use CPA and tax as my queries, and I was a little bit surprised from the records and the research that I found was that they were very vague. And so the California provides a template of what you can kind of send out to your customers if you have a breach. And one of the things that I saw in common was that you have to obviously say, well, we're going to pay for Experian or whatever to monitor your credit for a year. But it was very, very vague on what they actually had to say that happened. And a lot of times I felt like they didn't even know what really happened. So these statistics are kind of my assumptions based off of reading every single report. I see that there was about 12% of them I would categorize as email compromise. So that tells me that they're not using multi-factor authentication, they're using weak credentials, they're susceptible to phishing attacks. And in the most recent spear phishing campaign that we did for a local CPA firm, we had over 80% open rate. Right? And we sent that out on April 17th because we knew they'd be busy with taxes and filing at the last minute. So we waited the morning of that and we sent out our spear phishing campaign, and we got a large open rate and a large click-through rate. So we're seeing that could then lead to some of these other attacks like malware, unauthorized remote access, portal compromise, or any of these others up here. But Even 12% I think is too high for our CPAs and tax prep people. If they have public-facing sites or authentication such as webmail, Office 365, Google Apps, they need to have multi-factor authentication. We shouldn't see that there at all. The other ones I saw malware. So we don't really know what the malware did. It was very vague. They just said we got infected, a system got infected. I don't think they knew or they really spent the time investigating that of what the malware did. They might have just saw a pop-up come up and they said, okay, I've got malware or ransomware, and they don't really know. I even read one report and the CPA firm said, we got ransomware and so we're reporting this breach. For me, I have no idea why they're reporting a breach ransomware. I think that's encrypting your data. So was there something they're not sharing that, well, the data was also exfiltrated and they're not really letting us know? Or did they not really know what ransomware did and they thought they had to report it? So there's a lot of confusion in these reports. The other one that really surprised me doing this was physical security. So I was thinking, okay, a CPA firm, they know what they have. They've got these physical records, and they probably have these fireproof safes, and they're taking care of our data. 25% of the breaches stemmed from a physical security issue. So a laptop being stolen, someone breaking into the office, and this isn't just someone threw a brick through the window and they got in. This was data was actually taken out of the environment. We'll go into a couple examples of those as well. Okay, and then the other one was a lot of unauthorized remote access. Almost 40% was unauthorized remote access. What does that mean? I have no idea. That's how they kind of classified it. So did they have remote desktop open and they're the domain controller public facing on the internet? Were they using some remote software? Was their IT team doing something? Did they have VNC running? We don't really know exactly what that was. They just classified it as unauthorized remote access. Okay, and then what were the attackers actually after? This was really difficult for me to decipher because they don't say. They just kind of said, this large amount of data might have been stolen, and this is what we think might have happened, and this is the date range. We think there might have been someone in here. That's it. That's all we have. So a big part of that, 56%, I could not distinguish what the attacker was actually after. Was it to file extensions and get a refund? Was it to take your social security number and or medical records or whatever it was? I really don't know what they were trying to do. And I don't think we ever will. 25% was to file fraudulent returns. So that seems to be one of the targeted attacks. The goals of the attackers are to get your social security number and find out you're on extension and file the returns on your behalf to get that money. Okay, so I've got a couple local case studies in California, but I also have a couple larger companies. So even Deloitte, right? So we thought they were secure, E&Y is secure, these big companies. We even see that Deloitte had some of these issues as well. It's very difficult for me to find out what exactly happened in these private companies because the reporting requirements are so vague and subjective that you don't really have to say a lot of information. So if you look at Deloitte's website about the breach, they said that very few customers or clients were impacted, and they think it was only a couple. So they did not even put the breach in the California database. But then there's other sources that say all administrative accounts and all internal systems were compromised. So I'm not really sure which it is. We have conflicting information. The one that said that all administrator accounts and internal systems were compromised was supposed to be an internal employee, like a whistleblower. So we don't really know exactly what happened there either, but it may or may not have been a couple clients or all the clients. They got in a little bit of trouble because the breach happened in 2016, and then it wasn't until late 2017 they actually reported the breach. So it could have been an entire year that your social security number or your data has been leaked out. Okay, so more local ones in California. So Wheeler and Egger. They had a breach in the end of 2016 or mid-2016, and they reported it about a month later. They basically said a bad actor e-filed 45 2000 returns on extension. So this one actually was reported to me by one of our clients, and they said that they knew this company, and they had mentioned that it was a sophisticated attack. And what happened is the attackers were actually on the network quite a bit longer, and they didn't find out until about that month, and then they looked for specific customers that were high-income earners and that had filed an extension, and those 45 unique individuals out of thousands they targeted, and they saw that they would be able to get a substantial refund check because of their income level. They filed those returns, and they got the refund check, and they walked away with it. And then when the CPA firm went to go finish the extension and file the paperwork with the IRS and the state, the IRS, they kept getting rejections saying, you've already filed your return. That's a little bit strange. We did an extension. No one in the office knows about these people, and they did a couple more returns. They found another one and another one. I thought, this is unusual. We have so many people, and they're saying that they've already filed their returns, and they haven't left our firm or gone somewhere else. We know that they're our client. So they called the IRS, and the IRS said, we were about to come visit you. We know exactly what happened. So the IRS is looking for some of these things. They're aware of it, and we're seeing this more and more of these e-file returns by the bad actors. Right? And as usual, most of them will say that we don't know everything that was taken, but we assume it's your name, your gender, your date of birth, your telephone number, your address, social security numbers, EIN if applicable, your employment, W-2, 1099s, K-1s, etc., investment information, and more. So in this specific scenario, they assume it's malware. What I assume happened there is that they had some kind of, it was a targeted attack, and there was some type of, let's say, a reverse shell or something that they had access, because I don't think just malware is looking for tax data and then it's going to e-file a return. So I think that might have been the entry point, but there was a lot more. It was a sophisticated target attack. Jeffrey Bourne, CPA. This is the end of 2017, so you can see these are even recent scenarios that are happening. 2 unencrypted, password-protected laptops were stolen. So I kind of chuckled at this one, and I thought, well, they're saying, and I added unencrypted, but they just say to all of their customers that were affected by this breach that had their name, date of birth, telephone number, social security number, 1099s, tax data, insurance information, all the stuff that was leaked. They sent them a letter saying, we'll give you a year of protecting your identity. And really what happened is we had 2 laptops that were password protected, so it's okay, and they were stolen. But if you remember back on the reporting requirements, you only have to report if it's unencrypted, and it's a certain number of attacks, or breaches. So this basically is saying, yes, they were password protected, but this means the CPA is not doing basic security and encrypting those laptops, and essentially those laptops were taken. I can pull the hard drive out as a bad actor, and I can throw those into another machine, and I can see all that taxpayer data. Okay, Friedman Perry, CPA. This one happened, there was a span, so it's about a 6-month span that we see that where there's potential bad actors sitting on the target network, and it took them about 2-3 months to report this breach. And so they can see, they were able to determine that there was bad actors that came in from a foreign IP address, so they weren't using any kind of geo-IP filtering or protection against those foreign countries. And it looks like, from what I can read, that it was remote desktop protocol that they had access to. So this tells me that on their private network, they had remote desktop, port 3389, that was open, and someone was able to get in. I'm also going to make some assumptions there. They probably didn't have lockout policies or any thresholds or anything like that, so someone was probably brute forcing that, trying to get in to a system. And I can only imagine that it was a file server or a domain controller or something like that. Okay? And they filed a ton of fraudulent 2016 tax returns. So data that was accessed, again, full name, date of birth, telephone number, address, social security number, tons of other data relating to your taxes. Okay, and then this one is a little bit different. I got 2 more case studies here. So this one was TaxSlayer. There was a huge breach. Almost 9,000 tax records were released. And TaxSlayer, if you're not familiar with them, I believe it's a little bit more like TurboTax, where you can go on there and you can file your tax return, get help with your taxes. And so they had, from what the FTC said in their complaint, is that there was weak security measures that were involved that led to this breach of over 9,000 accounts. So usernames and passwords that were able to be compromised, they were able to get that. They were able to get in and see tax returns from 2014, social security numbers, name, addresses of 9,000 people. Okay, and then Intuit TurboTax tax. So I wanted to put this one in there because I figure a lot of people are probably using TurboTax, so according to the research. And Tim Tomes was actually the one that brought this to my attention as I was letting him know about this talk. And so from about 2010 to 2015, and the reports that I have here are a little bit vague, because a lot of it has been kind of suppressed. So 2010 to 2015, there's allegations in court cases as well as articles from whistleblowers that TurboTax knowingly was seeing fraudulent returns coming in, and they were basically ignoring that to keep the revenue high. So there's a couple court cases that people have filed, class action lawsuits, individuals, after these 2 individuals, ex-employees, Shane and Robert, that were in the Intuit, I think, security departments, and they notified management that we have clear evidence, or we have clear indications that these certain accounts are filing bad tax returns. For example, you see an account, a TurboTax account, and it's filing over 100 different tax returns. That doesn't really make sense. Why do you have 100 different social security numbers in there? So they brought that up. Or that there was multiple or duplicate social security numbers being filed with different TurboTax accounts. That's another indication. Why would a user try and file their taxes 3, 4, 5, 10 different times? And so they reported that to management, and management claimed that they're not going to do anything about that. And TurboTax makes about $150 from what I've seen filing these tax returns. So they thought, well, if we're getting this money, why suppress these? And so there's, I say these are allegations because they're in court documents, and I've got these in notes afterwards. I can share the link for this. But every court case that I saw that was filed against Intuit regarding this issue after these whistleblowers reported this were suppressed with arbitration agreements. So I'm assuming when you go and you sign up for TurboTax that they are saying, when you basically check that box and you go through, that you're agreeing to arbitration. So every time someone filed a lawsuit and said, you're leaking our data, you're breaching this, you're negligent, TurboTax and Intuit came back and said, look at that arbitration agreement. You can't do this in court. And they basically pushed it under the rug, and we don't know exactly what happened in arbitration. Intuit, I think their CISO it was that said this in one of the articles I read, is that it's IRS's job to catch fraudulent returns in response to this. So they're saying, no, it's IRS's business. We're just basically filing returns. It's not our responsibility. We're pushing it off on someone else. Intuit was granted dismissal and closed the door on arbitration, cited their case there. And the victims in this, all these people that had fraudulent e-file returns because TurboTax let them do this, even though they could have stopped it allegedly, they are no longer allowed to file e-returns. The IRS has said, someone has your social security number, you no longer do that. So now they're inconvenienced and they're damaged based off of this. And from what I saw in the court cases, it was over 30 hours per person that they dealt with these issues and all the problems dealing with the IRS and the states and trying to clear up their name for this. So it's a lot of pain, suffering, and financial impact to these individuals because their data got leaked, and Intuit allegedly had the ability to stop that. Okay, so let's look at some of these laws. I thought, okay, there's got to be laws for this, right? We've got HIPAA, we've got PCI DSS, we've got all these laws. There's got to be some cybersecurity laws for this. And I talked to some CPA firms and tax preparing firms about this. I said, what are you bound by? And they said, well, the IRS tells us all the stuff we have to do. I thought, okay, so they've got some laws. They said there's the AI, CPA, they've got some laws, and they said state laws. So I started doing some research. And I like to think I'm pretty good at Google searching. That's how I'm in IT, I'm in security. That's where I got to where I am. But the AI CPA says that there are actually no uniform federal laws on business cybersecurity, and this is relating to CPA firms. So there's nothing federally saying that. But okay, maybe the IRS has something. I looked at the IRS and scavenged through their site, and I see that there's a quote, the IRS recommends preparers create a security plan. That's pretty much what they say. That's their law. GLBA or GLB was probably the closest thing that I saw to a law that applies to CPA or tax prep firms. So there's a safeguard rule that says you need to designate one employee to coordinate InfoSec. You need to identify risky PII. And you need to design, implement, monitor, test safeguards. This law was enacted in 1999. Has cyber changed since then? I like to think so. Okay, so I think that this is a little bit outdated and it's not really doing a whole lot of protections. And I've gone through so many security programs and policies and built them for customers and whatnot, and they'll say, okay, it's a requirement from a customer or a regulation that I have someone designated as our InfoSec person. Office manager, that's you. They don't really know what they're doing. There's no training involved with this. So these are kind of like checkbox items, identifying and assess risky PII. I guarantee if I went to a CPA and said this is a requirement, they're going to go ahead and say, well, tax returns, that's it. That's all I have. But they're not really doing anything to protect these. There is the financial privacy rule requirement the IRS has. There's a couple sections of IRS code that require for disclosure and penalties for unauthorized disclosure. But again, it's not really anything preventing or keeping CPAs in check. Right? And I use the CPA term, but it's really tax preparers. You don't have to be a CPA to do tax preparation. You have to take a quick test. The IRS has some requirements I did find for e-file security. So if you're e-filing or your tax person's e-filing or you use TurboTax because they're e-filing for you, there are there's 6 requirements that they give out. One of them is have extended validated SSL certificate. Okay? It doesn't even have to be really installed properly. You just have to have one. Weekly external vulnerability scans. I have seen so many vulnerability scans, and I have rarely seen someone actually take their own vulnerability scan and do something about it. The Department of Defense is probably one of the closest ones that do it pretty well, but a lot of people will get those vulnerability scans, and they look at it and they say, I've got a lot to do. I'm overwhelmed, we don't have the resources, so we're checking the box. We have a vuln scan, we know that there's vulnerabilities, but we don't have time to fix it. Or, I don't really know how to fix this. It says that my server is accepting remote desktop, but I need access remote desktop. Or, it's using weak ciphers, but I'm not really sure how to fix that. And we're not going to pay for an InfoSec person to come in. So, I have the vulnerability scan, I did my job, but that's it. And it's external vulnerability scan if you see as well. So, external vuln scan, you probably have a firewall, maybe a Palo Alto, a SonicWall, a Cisco, whatever it is, and it's doing a fairly good job. And I really think when I do security assessments and pen tests, I don't try and attack the external gateway. That's very difficult for me to do. I'm not that smart to break into one of those, but I can phish a user and I can go on the inside, or I can drop a USB drive, or I can do other things internally where it's much easier, lower hanging fruit to get in. They need to have information policies and safeguard policies, but as much as I like policies, a lot of people they've got it in place, it's a checkbox, they don't look at it, they don't update it, it's not really doing its job. You need to have a website with CAPTCHA, right? And so you might have, you accept tax returns, something like that, so you have to have CAPTCHA. Again, it doesn't have to be properly implemented or tested, you just have to have it. Your domain has to be registered in the United States, okay? And then you have to report security incidents, but that's also a state and federal requirement. So there's not really a whole lot that they're mandating, even if you're doing e-files. They do have this. So if you've got a CPA or maybe you work for a tax prep firm, this is a little snippet from a PDF that I found that I actually thought was pretty good that the IRS posted. And so they've got this, I think it was 2018, June 2018 was the last revision of this PDX. It's called the Safeguarding Taxpayer Data. It's a PDF, it's pretty lengthy, and it's got some really good checklist items. So you can go through there and you can say ongoing, or you've done, or it's not applicable, but you can maintain this, and it's a pretty good checklist for security, and it's geared at tax preparers or CPA firms. Okay, and again, to kind of combat what some people are saying is, oh no, we're getting better, we're not seeing as many fraudulent returns, we're not targets, we're blah, blah, blah. From what I see from the IRS commissioner himself has said the threat remains, and we need to help tax professionals take basic steps, so they're not even taking basic steps to safeguard systems and taxpayer data. Okay, this is a site, it was dwt.com. It was awesome. It prepared this graphical map for me that showed me what are the breach notification statutes in the different states. So we can see that most states, the ones in yellow here, you only have to report the breach. So if your taxpayer data gets out in any other state except for a couple of those green ones, and it's physical copies, so your whole CPA office gets ransacked and they take all his file cabinets, they don't even have to let you know about that. Right? So most of it's just electronic data. There's also another way for them to kind of get out of reporting the breaches as well. There's a harm threshold. So the ones in yellow here have that harm threshold where it's notifications not required if in good faith and prompt investigation, the covered entity determines that the breach is not reasonably likely to cause substantial harm to you. Okay, so there's a lot of subjective things, reasonable, substantial, etc., good faith, what's a prompt investigation. There's a lot of things in there that they can weasel their way out of. There's also, as I mentioned, the encryption safe harbor. So if you've got encrypted, truncated, obfuscated, so you take a social security number, you convert it to base 64, they may argue, well, we don't have to report this because it's obfuscated. Okay, and so in California has a couple laws. You've got the breach notification laws, and that's where I got a lot of my data. And there's finally one. This one has not been, it's been put into law, but it doesn't really, you don't have to follow it until 2020. It's the California Consumer Protection Act. This is one I found out about recently. 2020, you have to start, it's enforceable. It allows consumers to sue companies for unauthorized access, exfiltration, theft, and disclosure of your information. So in the future, we should have this. This is supposed to be kind of to be similar to GLB and whatnot. So California breaches. So here's the problem that I found. So there's, in all the breaches I've read and the CPA firms I've done security assessment for, I see a common theme here. So there's a broken record. There's improper basic security controls. There's file servers with taxpayer data that has full control with anyone in the office. So everyone full control on these shares, NTFS and the share permissions. The IT people just don't understand that, or they're not locking it down for whatever reason. There's other things like passwords, shared passwords in the office, these basic controls that are not put into place. We see lack of logging. So in all these breaches, it's a lot of, I don't know what happened. I'm not really exactly sure. We think this happened. So we're seeing they're not logging properly. They're not notifying. There's no encryption on taxpayer data. Laptops are being stolen. Backups are being stolen. Unauthorized access to these systems. And what I'll show you and towards the end of my talk here of actual tax software that they're using to file your tax returns, they're not even encrypted at rest, in process, or in transit. We're seeing that there's no clear understanding of what data was taken. It's kind of like we weren't logging properly. We don't have IR policy. We're not really sure. So we know someone got in because something happened, but sorry, we don't know. And then they'll give you 1 year of identity theft protection. So as me as the attacker, thinking as the bad person, if I breach a CPA firm or a tax prep firm, then I'm going to wait 13 months, and then I'm going to go ahead and do identity theft after that point. So you're still impacted after 1 year, but they're only required to do the 1 year of identity protection. And they play down the severity of what happens. I'll show you that in a second. Some of them are paraphrased, some of them are exact quotes from these breaches, and I'll translate that into what it really means. So they're playing down what happened, and for the end user, not you who are at a security conference, but your parents, your grandparents, your relatives who are in different industries, they might see that and say, oh, a password-protected laptop was stolen. We're safe. It's okay. We're good. They don't understand what this actually means, and there's no requirement to educate the users. And then reading the breach reports, it's not clear what, who, how, when, or what they're even doing to protect this in the future. There's nothing that requires them to actually take better controls in the future or make sure that they've remediated all the security issues. Okay, so let me translate some of these reports for you. So statement, a password-protected laptop was stolen. That means the laptop was not encrypted, your sensitive data has been accessed by someone else, and they could just plug it into another laptop and they can see everything that was on it. Another statement, we found unauthorized access to our secure network. If there's unauthorized access, is it really secure? We immediately contacted our IT consultant and promptly hired an IT security expert. So our IT consultant doesn't really understand security, and we didn't have the proper controls in place. Another one, the attacker managed to hack into our systems despite the use of firewalls and antivirus software. So really, they're just checking a box, or they didn't implement it properly. They don't understand the security controls. Another statement, backup hard drives were stolen, though they require proprietary software to be readable. I downloaded every single software except for one, and within a matter of about 10 minutes in AWS, spun them up, and I was able to read database files. Also, most, and I won't disclose exactly which vendors, but most of the tax prep softwares, I found the file that they're actually storing all the PII data and your tax data, pretty much everything in the software, and they are in some proprietary format. But if you've ever used the strings tool in Linux, or you can download it for Windows, all your data is in strings, clear text. So you can just read it with that. So that proprietary software for me, I don't even need to install it. I can just run strings against the file. I'll give granted, some of them, they did make it a little difficult to find, and I had to dig around in directories, but it didn't take too long. Also, none of that data has been encrypted. They wouldn't have to do these reports. Another statement, we take aggressive steps to protect your information to ensure all records are securely locked. This isn't a breach notice. So the data was not securely locked, it was unencrypted, and someone already got your data. Okay? But I think these are important because non-security people are seeing this and they're saying, oh, okay, they take aggressive steps, they securely lock this thing, it wasn't their fault. Right? And maybe they did do a good job. Maybe I'm being too hard on them. But from what I've seen and doing more and more research in this is that everyone's passing the ball as far as who's responsible for this. The CPAs aren't responsible because they're buying secure, protected software, and they're buying firewalls and antivirus software. And the vendors I've spoke to, we're not at fault because there's clear text protocols that the CPAs are using. And also, it's the IRS's responsibility, not ours. So everyone's kind of passing the ball. And the IRS says CPAs need to take basic steps to secure this stuff. So who's really responsible for our tax data? So let's look at some of the software that the CPAs and tax people are using. So there's this great survey from the Accountancy, or the Journal of Accountancy, that I grabbed. They provided this awesome information. So there's really only a handful of software that the tax pros are using. Again, this is not the TurboTax or I think H&R Block has their own proprietary software. These are, if you go to a CPA firm, a tax prep firm, this is what they're using. And if we add up all the different categories except for other, we're going to see that it's about 84-ish%, if I did the math right, that they're using the top 5 pieces of software. Even if we take the top 2 here, and we see that the UltraTax TS and ProSystem, that makes up pretty darn close to 50%. It's a little less than 50% of that. So these are major targets here. The 2017 survey did a little better job than the 2016 survey, and they broke it down by number of preparers. And this is one of my favorite slides for when I started talking to these vendors that make the tax software, and they would say to me flat out, and this is even as of Monday of this week, they told me, well, we're working on securing the software still, we're putting a patch out soon, but our software is not meant for large CPA firms, or our software is not meant to be shared amongst multiple CPAs. It's for one user and a client only. And I look at this and I would show them this and say, wait a second, and I won't name the vendor, but I'd say, pretty much if you look at some of these, and let's just, again, it's not them, but let's take CCH and say, okay, well, if you're saying that, over 100 users, the CPA firms, 30% of the CPAs are using your software in 100 more environment. So even though you say we don't recommend it and it's not designed for that, that's not how it's actually being used. And you have KB articles, you help people install it on server client models and topologies. So even though you're saying one thing, it's not your responsibility, we can see the data that it's being used a certain way, and you as the manufacturer of this tax software that's holding sensitive data, you are responsible for protecting all of our tax data inside of it. Okay, and this one, I'm going to kind of skip through this, but I've got, again, these slides later on. I tried to find, looking through surveys of why CPAs are using one software over another based off the size of their firm. I didn't find a lot of information that kind of correlated it. I could see ease of use was a big one. It's funny, but price was a big reason that a lot of people either switched software or bought one software. So price and ease of use seemed to be the reason that one piece of software was more popular than another. And support, I didn't find too much different on this, but one thing I also noticed looking at all these different tables was there was nothing on security. They didn't do any surveys of how important security to you. What measures, the steps that the provider of the software is using for security, is that important? Is it not important? Anything like that? It's not even part of this survey here at all. Okay, so let's look at some of the testing of the tax software. And I want to go into a couple definitions before showing some screenshots. Because I've had a lot of debate with different tax software and vendors and people, and they're trying to argue whose fault it is. So I thought Troy's Hunt quote on pwn passwords was pretty good. He says, the entire point is to ensure that any personal info in a secure data is obfuscated such that it requires a concerted effort to remove the protection, but that the data is still usable for its intended purpose. So we need to protect the data, but also make sure it's usable. When I looked at MITRE and I thought, well, how do I start registering these CVEs? Because I'm not really a software person. I don't do exploit development or security research. This is my first project in this. I'm really focused on securing businesses and doing some security assessments and pen testing. And so as I looked through this, I thought, okay, well, how exactly do I classify this? And I kept getting pushback from the vendors and saying, no, it's not a vulnerability. It's an exposure. It's not this. It's not that. It's not our fault. It's really the protocol. So I kind of want to go through these. And while I do think that these are some exposures, I also think there's some vulnerability to it. So with an exposure, a systems configuration issue, or a mistake in the software that allows access to information or capabilities that can be used by an attacker as a stepping stone into a system or a network. So I thought, well, it kind of makes sense, but it's not a stepping stone. If you're an attacker and you're after social security numbers, names, date of birth, tax data, is it a stepping stone, or did you get the jackpot there? Then when I look at vulnerability, is weakness in a logic found in software and hardware components that, when exploited, results in a negative impact to confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Well, these exposures do have a negative impact on confidentiality. I would assume you want your social security number and your home address and your phone number and spouse information remain private. And then so if we look at the definition of access control or improper access control, which I registered most of these CVEs under, they're defined as the software does not restrict or incorrectly restricts access to a resource from unauthorized actor. And so I went back to this as that's a definition of vulnerability. It's one of the subcategories you can register the CVE under. And the manufacturer of one of the software kept saying, it's not really weakness, it's not our responsibility, it's a clear text protocol, or there's other servers or things that are leaking the data, it's not us. But again, this here, and I underline it, the software does not restrict or incorrectly restricts access from unauthorized actors. So I do think that they're responsible for protecting that. So in my findings, I found, in looking at these different CPA firms, that if you have more than one CPA or tax preparer, even if it's one CPA and an office administrator, the office administrator still needs access to the tax software because it's a CRM as well. They need the phone number, the name, they need to print documents. So even if it's a one CPA with an assistant or an office manager, you're still probably doing a client-server topology, even though most of these vendors, when I spoke to them, were saying that it's not meant to be that way. It's only supposed to be client setup. So we're not seeing that, even though they're saying that's how it's supposed to be. Okay, and they also said, well, if you're going to do client server, you need multiple people to access the software, you need to set up terminal services or remote desktop services. Great. Now we've got remote desktop running around on our network that we have to control as well. Also, the default setup when you start installing softwares in a client-server relationship is using SMB version 2. Many of the software vendors don't recommend SMV3 due to performance. So when I first started this in my first disclosure and I contacted the vendor, almost slipped with their name, they said, no, we don't recommend SMV version 3. There's a performance hit. We don't even support that. And I kept going up the chain, eventually in security managers and their InfoSec team and developers. And they finally said, at the end of 4 months now working with them, they said, our recommendation is to use SMB version 3 with encryption. Okay, I thought there was a performance impact. No, there's not a performance impact. Okay, so are you recommending that now, or are you requiring that? Because going back to the slide here, the software needs to restrict access or unauthorized access. And they said, well, we can't force people to use that, so we're just going to recommend that, and that's our solution to the data exposure. Well, if you're not restricting it, you're not really doing your job, you're not being responsible for this. So vendors claim they don't recommend the client-server relationship. The sensitive data is analyzed in transit and rest, at least from what I found. I didn't even look at it in memory and process because I'm making an assumption it's already in clear text anyways. Still working with vendors on the patches. So no one yet, out of all the tax software I've tested, no one has fixed the problem yet. Right? And this reported 4 months ago was the start of this. I'm still working with them. I had a call as of Monday with one of the teams, also with their compliance, which I think is a fancy word for their legal counsel. And one of them is releasing a patch tomorrow, which I'm very grateful for. And they were actually the last person I found, or the last vendor that I found the issue with, and I reported to them, and they're releasing a patch tomorrow. So kudos to them. But still, there's a lot of issues, and they're only fixing one of the 2 issues. So I did some screenshots there for illustration. Originally, I had exactly which vendor, the CVEs, how I found this, and I had to tweak this because I'm shocked that they still haven't fixed these issues, but my CPAs, every CPA I've ever used, their software is still vulnerable. So I don't really want to give you all the details, and you go find my CPA, and now you've got my tax data. A lot of security pros that I know, I've asked them, hey, what does your CPA use? And then I've gone and test that software, and it's vulnerable too. So I feel like all of our data, if we use a CPA, we're probably still vulnerable to this. So I'm trying to keep it a little bit under the rug until maybe another couple months or 2, and then I'll post a blog, and then I'm also going to be talking at ISACA in Nova Scotia, Canada, and I'll release all the details pending that they please fix these issues. So these screenshots that I have coming up here, they are defanged, and some of them don't exactly map one-to-one, but I'm trying to kind of hide who was vulnerable, but you'll still get an illustration of what was leaked out. So I first did a little bit of research. I thought, okay, well, maybe someone else found these CVEs and it just hasn't been fixed. So I looked at UltraTax, which was the most popular one. MITRE and ExploitDB, 0. No vulnerabilities disclosed. How is this popular? That's the most popular tax software, billions of dollar industry, and there's no vulnerabilities in the software that's made a long time ago? This is incredible. So I looked for ProSystem FX. One vulnerability, but it's like a DLL buffer overflow. It's not really related to this at all. Intuit Lacert. And by the way, Intuit owns quite a few of these as well. So what we see just in Intuit Lacert, that's the one I'm the most familiar with because I've had a lot of customers with it, and I've worked with it when I did IT in the past. But they own a couple of these. Nothing. Not a single vulnerability that I could find out there. Drake Tax. Nothing. Okay, ProSeries vulnerability research. There was one. This one's definitely, it was a DLL. Some have buffer overflow and like QuickBooks, and applied to a couple of them. And that was 2007. That's quite a bit of time ago as well. Okay, so let's look into this. So I grabbed the software, and again, this isn't specifically the software, but every piece of software I used, I put in fake data here. Obviously, my name is still there, but I put in a fake social security number of all ones, just occupation security guru, a date of birth that made me apparently 106 years old. all this other stuff in there, put my fake wife's information in there, her social security number, so I could see what's coming out. So I added in as a new customer. Some more information I added in. Again, I just kind of incremented all the numbers so I could see what was what, and I documented this. Hey, some more tax information. I could put what state I'm filing in, etc., driver's license information, spouse, dependents, etc. Some of the software even asked me to upload pictures of a driver's license picture, and also bank account numbers so that you can have your taxes and the money funneled out to the IRS. And I'll show you how that's interesting in a second. So once I added the record and a bunch of other fake records in here, we can see on the default, this is like a customer list of everything that was in the database. Name, customer number, primary social security number, and then the status of the return, and then what state that they're filing in there. So once I basically, most of the software, when you launch, you've got the server that's running, it's got the database file. When you've got the client and you open it up, sometimes there's a password, sometimes it doesn't require a password at all, which whole other issue, but you log in, and so then what the client is doing, oops, down one, the client then says an SMB request for a file, and I've redacted that, and it does a read request and then gets a read response. And so when I did a pen test, I saw tons of SMB, and I thought, wait a second, why is this tax software doing this? And so then I saw, okay, this is not good. Ones were my social security number, twos was my wife's social security number. So in clear text, I'm seeing that come across in transit over the wire. Then, to my surprise, this was one of the worst ones that I found, the client. So in the red is the client's request, and we don't see the full conversation. Blue is the server's response. When the CPA logs in or they launch the client on their workstation, the server then sends an entire copy of the database of all customers, including social security number, home address, name, occupation, pretty much everything you can need here. Spouse's number, account number, mobile phone numbers, email addresses, where they work, PO box, home address, and they logged in. They didn't even request the file. It just basically sent 1,000, in this first case study that I did, over 1,000 records and social security numbers in clear text on the network. A little closer view of that. And I thought, okay, so what about when I make a change inside a customer? So you logged in, all that data is just exposed in clear text, and we see all that. That's fine. What about actual W-2s when you file that? So I opened up the software here, and I put in a fake, I wish this was a real amount that I made every year, but $9,999,000. And I watched with TCP dump and Wireshark what was going to happen over the network. And in clear text, I can see not only that record that showed up, but again, the client sent all that taxpayer data, social security number, name, home address, etc., everything to the server. The server responded with the same thing. I guess they wanted both to share the information over the network. And then it was an entire record here of every number that I had in my tax record. So W-2, 1099s, etc. So you could map this out, and you could basically this is the tax return, essentially, of the customer. Okay, I thought, okay, that's bad. Now I tested a different piece of software. I thought, they can't all be like this. This has got to be a 1 in a million I stumbled upon this. Nope, the second one I tested, same kind of issue. It didn't do the entire customer database, so thank you for you who made the software, but you did still send the client ID, the client name, social security numbers, who filed the tax return, the taxes they filed, what state, if it's federal, and then they also sent in a nice piece of information for the attacker, the bank name, and then the bank account number as well. So now you can pretend to be them, and you can go into their bank and try and steal money from them as well. So I thought, okay, so let me look at these database files. So now that was in transit. Now I took a look at rest. So these proprietary software have to be encrypted. They have to have the data sitting on disk, and it has to be protected. It just had to be an issue with reading that was the vulnerability. So I ran strings, and yes, you can get strings for Windows. And so I ran strings against these database files, redacted the file name. And this one was interesting because the ones were my social security number. They really wanted to share that with someone, right? I don't know if that was like a placeholder, if it was blank or what was going on, but they essentially just dumped my social security number, and then the twos were my wife's social security number and some other information such as phone number, job title, names, etc. And it just kept going on and on and on. So basically, yes, you can't open these database files just with Notepad or something like that, but if you run strings against them, you're going to see everything inside without authenticating. Hey, here's another one. This one, you could see everything else. A lot of weird characters and stuff in there, but essentially jobs, titles, names. This is basically the whole database file as well. This one was one of the best ones that I saw. Okay, so some discussion with the vendors. It was somewhat difficult to reach them. Right? I had a hard time getting a hold of security teams. Eventually, I had to even try and threaten them on Twitter and other places and say, I have a vulnerability in your software, please respond. The worst one I got was one vendor. I only found the support team because sales and other people wouldn't respond to me. And the support team said, you need a customer ID and PIN number. Like, no, I'm a security researcher doing this stuff. I have information for free, I'm helping you. Sorry, you need a customer ID or we will not respond to you anymore. Do you not understand? I posted a link to this talk and an article I wrote, and so I said, I will be exposing this to hackers this week if you do not respond to me. So that's why I had the call with their legal counsel and a bunch of other people on Monday. They apparently, my tweets when I said, hey, you've got this vulnerability, blah, 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 they kept getting deleted. I still have to look into that. I don't know if Twitter was deleting them or there's keywords or what was going on, but they kept just disappearing. The vendors claim they didn't delete it or don't have responsibility for that. Some of the vendors have private bug bounty programs with BugCrowd and HackerOne, but I'm not part of them, so I couldn't get in there and tell them the issue. They need to make these public. They need to make this accessible for people who want to responsibly disclose this. They denied initially that it was their responsibility, and they said the issue was SMB version 2. I told them, if I'm a bank and I have your login over HTTP, it's not my responsibility then either. That's yours, right? You should be using VPNs. They didn't quite agree with that either. So I said, no, you can't force someone else to use SMB version 3 with encryption, have them set up. It's your responsibility as a vendor to make this secure at rest, in transit, and in process. They said the software wasn't meant to be client-server. They say that there's legacy software going back to 2015. We can't patch those issues. We don't support it that old. So some of this stuff's never going to get patched. They said encryption would break integration with third party. They say that's why they can't do anything, is because there's other third parties that you can like link your bank and this and that, and they would break too many pieces of software, so they don't want to make it harder to use. So that's why they're not fixing it, or they're having a difficult time doing that. One vendor patched their vulnerability or is doing that tomorrow, and I really appreciate that they're doing that and taking it so seriously. I reported it 2 weeks ago, and they're actually doing something about it. So I'm not going to name them because they haven't fixed all of it, but I really appreciate that. And anyone who is a software vendor in here or works for a company, we're trying to do the best thing as presenters and security researchers. So go ahead and take our free help, and please patch your software before disclosing it. So now what? So wrapping up here, so interview your CPA. Right? And so say, hey, what are you doing? Are you encrypting your backups? I'm seeing a lot of data that's not being, it's backed up, but it's not encrypted at all. How are you encrypting it? Interview them a little more. When was your last pen test or vol scan? What are you doing about that? So interview them a little bit. Don't just say, hey, you're the cheapest price, I'm going to use you. What exactly are you doing? And eventually I'm going to turn this into a checklist similar to the IRS's one, so people can use this and interview their CPA. What's your incident response policy, right? Your IT person probably doesn't know security or incident response, so who do you have? Do you have someone on retainer? Do you have insurance? What are you going to do about this? And then what policies do you have in place? Make people aware. Share the link for this. I have blog posts. I have the slides on our website that you can send out or give to people. Make them aware, and let's try and get this fixed as well. I really want this problem fixed for the general public. Help test tax software. If you're a security researcher and AppSec, please help test it. I am not an AppSec person, so I'm sure there's a lot more problems. We saw there's no vulnerabilities posted except for a couple of buffer overflows and myself. So please try and test the software. Your CPA, they can do defense in depth. You can help them out, build security programs. Do not use wireless on production network. Have them use multi-factor authentication for everything that's public facing. Have them encrypt everything at rest. I see FTP servers open, remote desktop servers. Have them encrypt and lock things down. Make sure that their tax prep workstations that are accessing these softwares are dedicated and isolated. And use endpoint protection, maybe EDR, buzzword. Who's doing it right? This is my last slide. Drake Software, I'm going to name one vendor. I think they're doing a pretty good job. They may not have things perfect, but these are some pop-ups I got. They notify you when there's sensitive data that you're looking at. They pop these things up when there's an update and say, you cannot use your software unless you patch it with these security issues. Thank you. They also, if you don't touch the keyboard, they mandatory require a password, and then if you don't touch the keyboard, it locks out. All these are default settings. I didn't touch these. Every other tax software did not have a password when I set it up. Didn't require it. It didn't require updates. So they're doing a fairly good job. They also are encrypting at rest and in transit from what I've seen as well. So that's my findings. I thank you for coming out here again in an early morning. If you want to contact me, I've got my contact information up there, Twitter, LinkedIn, an email address. And if you go to corporateblue.com/blog, I do have the slides of this, and you can download a PDF with all my notes and research, case studies, surveys, all that kind of stuff, so you can look at that a little bit more. Happy to take, are we doing questions? Outside? Apologize about that. So if there's any questions, I'll be standing outside, happy to answer them. If it's related to this or other topics, I'm happy to chat, and I'll be out there. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.